Welcome to this Saturday Travel and History Tip, and we are continuing our Fort series in Wyoming. I will not be covering Fort Casper over in Casper, Wyoming, but choosing to focus on Fort Laramie, the crossroads of a nation moving west. Originally established as a private fur trading fort in 1834, Fort Laramie evolved, I seriously doubt that, into the largest and best-known military post on the northern plains before its abandonment in 1890. This grand old post witnessed the entire sweeping saga of America's western expansion and Indian resistance to encroachment on their territories. And I want to make a note here that because something is called a fort, it isn't necessarily a military post. Many were trading posts, often fortified by military, and sometimes they were established strictly as military. So just because something is called a fort, it does not mean that it was a military outpost. It could have been basically a trading post. Fort Laramie is located at the confluence of the Laramie and the North Platte Rivers in southeast Wyoming. This famed outpost, first as a fur trade post and then as a military garrison, played a strategic role in transforming the United States. Here, for 56 years, successive waves of trappers, traders, Native Americans, missionaries, immigrants, soldiers, miners, ranchers, and homesteaders interacted and left their mark on a place that would become famous in the history of the American West, Fort Laramie. And a second note is that these forts and trading posts were often regarded as safe zones. No fighting was allowed. This was an area where people could trade. Overlanders could trade with Indians, and Indians could negotiate with the military. Most immigrants agreed that the easiest part of the overland trail was the 500-mile stretch that followed the Platte River across Nebraska's prairie. They knew that crossing into Wyoming, the terrain would change. Fort Laramie lies 50 miles west of Scotts Bluff, Nebraska. Most travelers approached Fort Laramie from the main Oregon and California roads along the south bank of the North Platte River. This required fording a tributary, the Laramie River, just east of the fort. Today, dams have tamed the Laramie, but in the mid-1800s, the river's spring current sometimes toppled wagons and drowned immigrants and livestock. Looking for the safest place to ford, travelers used at least 9 different crossings of the Laramie, and bridges and ferries eventually served some locations. For travelers north or south of the river, Fort Laramie was a major milestone, sitting at the edge of the western plains where the land begins to lift toward the slopes of the Rockies. West of the fort rose the blue-gray beacon of Laramie Peak, looking like a dark cloud on the western horizon, according to John Bidwell. The steepest, roughest, driest, and most dangerous stretches of road lay ahead. Travelers paused to lighten their wagons by selling unnecessary items, tools, books, clothing, furnishings, even wagons and food at Fort Laramie. But buyers were scarce. Most disappointed sellers simply destroyed or dumped their possessions along the trail. Fort Laramie National Historic Site is located in the town of Fort Laramie. There is a visitor center, a museum, and 12 restored buildings to help to tell its story. The 832-acre Fort Laramie National Historic Site features 12 restored buildings with intricately detailed furnished rooms, numerous fragile ruins, including a hospital and non-commissioned officers' quarters, and artillery pieces from the Queen Outpost of the Frontier Army. Interpreters clad in 19th century military uniforms add depth to the park. We greatly enjoyed the living history cannon shooting demonstrations. The 1876 bakery is where 700 18-ounce loaves of bread were baked daily. See the mock bakery with bread loaves on display. During the 1850s, 50,000 individuals passed that way annually. There was a 45-day window when the fort came alive with overlanders needing to cross the Rocky Mountains before snowfall. Close your eyes and imagine being there during the mid to late 1800s. Hear the voices of the pioneers, mountain men, Indians, and soldiers. Listen to the noises from the livestock, native animals, and the workmen. Smell the bread baking and feel the summer wind blow in your face. When visiting a historic site, give all your senses a history lesson. The visitor center is located in the 1884 commissary storehouse and should be your first stop. Take notice of the framed section of the original wall where a soldier etched his name and military rank. There is a charge for the audio tour, but it is well worth it. This is the site of the Army Bridge. The Laramie River was unpredictable and unchecked by dams. High water during the spring of the year often damaged or washed away existing bridges. Therefore, from 1853 to post-abandonment in 1890, the river was spanned by several successive bridges on or near this site. The first was constructed by a private firm which charged tolls to both soldiers and immigrants. There is a small cemetery, and we found this grave, Unknown Soldier, U.S. Army. Indian Wars. I know I have mentioned the paintings of William Henry Jackson in a previous Saturday Travel and History Tip, and I want to mention him again because he is famous for painting the forts of the West. Fort Laramie held a specific importance for William Henry Jackson. One would assume that the long, hard days on the trail would have been enough to distract the thoughts of a lovelorn young man, but that was not the case with William Henry Jackson. In fact, the grinding monotony only served to give him more time on which to dwell on his failed relationship. By the time he reached Fort Laramie, Jackson had worked himself up to the hope that there would be a letter waiting for him at the post, telling him to come home. Post office? Many people received letters at these posts, and they looked forward to getting there not only for refreshments, but also to get mail. A person can easily imagine that expectation Jackson experienced when Fort Laramie's postmaster handed him several letters with postmarks from home, only to experience a crushing disappointment when the realization came that none of the letters were from his sweetheart. This emotional turmoil probably explains why Jackson made little mention of Fort Laramie in his diary and why no sketches of the post exist. The two paintings that Jackson later produced of the site depict a much earlier view of Fort Laramie before the fur trading post, known as Fort John, was purchased by the U.S. Army in 1849. The adobe walled structures with the prominent towers was the only stockade Fort Laramie ever had, but it had been torn down prior to Jackson's arrival in 1866. The fort Jackson visited had no defensive wall and simply consisted of a number of buildings surrounding a large parade ground. In 1866, Fort Laramie was an extremely active military post in the midst of major transformation. The end of the American Civil War resulted in an increase in the number of immigrants on the trail, and it meant that the volunteer soldiers who had been stationed at Fort Laramie had to be mustered out of the service and replaced by officers and soldiers of the regular army. This all took time, and when Jackson arrived at Fort Laramie on August 7, 1866, the last of the volunteers had only just been relieved by the 18th U.S. Infantry a few weeks before, more than a year after the end of the war. And as you can see, this fort, it is so famous because it was a trading post, a protection place for overlanders, and part of the Civil War. Jackson had also just missed the signing of a treaty at Fort Laramie between the government and the Brule Sioux. That's a story in itself, a sad one at that, hoping to bring an end to the warfare that had inflamed the plains since 1864. Colonel Mayniter and Indian Agent Taylor had been conducting negotiations with the various bands of the Sioux since June. They were trying to alleviate confrontations between the overlanders and the military and the Sioux tribe. Unfortunately, the arrival of the 18th U.S. Infantry during these negotiations caused the wary Sioux leader Red Cloud to withdraw. The treaty that was signed was worthless, and the warfare continued for another 2 years. Bypassed by the Transcontinental Railroad and relegated to functioning as a supply base after the end of the Sioux Wars in 1877, the fort was eventually abandoned by the Army in 1890. Some of the buildings were used by people who homesteaded on the grounds of the old fort, while other buildings were sold at auction and dismantled for use elsewhere. Jackson revisited Fort Laramie in 1937, and his efforts to document its history undoubtedly assisted the efforts that finally resulted in the post becoming a National Historic Site and being protected by the National Park Service. Thank you, William Henry Jackson. Wagons are worth nothing. We frequently cook our suppers with the spokes of a better wagon than half the farmers in St. Louis County own. R.H.D., a newspaper correspondent 10 miles west of Fort Laramie, 1859. It's all part of American history. Learn it, love it, appreciate it. Don't let them steal our history. Share our American history. Next Saturday, we'll be going to Nebraska and to Fort Robinson. Hope you watch the Saturday Travel and History Tips. If you appreciate our content, tell others and repost on your social platforms. Thank you.